Hello there, Michelle Short here for Spellbinders. Today I'm sharing some inspiration using the Just Add Cake birthday card making kit. My focus today is on the garden party dies, but I'm also using some other elements from the kit as well. I'm using the Just Add Cake Sentiments stamp set and coordinating dies. I'm also using the sequins and the shaker domes. And then I'm also using lots of colours from the Colour Wheel cardstock pack in the kit. For my second card, I'm incorporating the Birthday Brew die set. So let's get started with the first card. The colours that I'm using for this card are Chiffon, Blush, Tutu, Beeswax and Rainforest. So I'm starting off by die cutting the flowers from the Tutu and the Blush cardstock, and then the flower centres from Beeswax. So I've placed those down, cut side down onto my cardstock, and I'm holding them in place with some Best Ever craft tape, and then running those through my die cutting machine. And then for the stems, I'm using the Rainforest cardstock. And again, placed those down onto the cardstock and held them down with some low tack tape. I am cutting all of the stems. I wasn't sure at this point which ones I actually needed. In the end, I did cut a few extra of the longer ones. And then for the first round of die cutting, I cut the larger flowers and then also those smaller buds from the Tutu cardstock. So I just want to run them back through with the Blush cardstock. I'm then taking the die that cuts the flower centre from this larger flower, and I'm going to cut that out of this flower here so that I can place the shaker dome inside. It's really great that you've got different options. You can either use it as a piece on top of that flower, or you can cut it out and add the shaker dome underneath. So I can bring in that shaker dome, just checking that that's going to fit nicely. And then I can add some double-sided tape onto the top of this shaker dome. So I'm just manipulating that tape around the shape here. There's a little kind of rim on that shaker dome, so I'm just popping that tape on top. I can then cut off the excess with my scissors, and then I'm going to use my tweezers just to remove the backing off of that tape. I can then bring in my flower that's got the centre cut out. And these do fit in a slightly different way, as in some ways are a little bit more snug than other ways. So I'm just finding the way that fits perfectly, and then I can press that down, make sure that that's going to stick down really nicely. And then I'm going to use the lighter shade, the blush shade, as my backing so that you can see the lighter shade through the centre of the flower. So I can now bring in the sequins, and there's lots of lovely colours in here. I'm going to use the ones for the shaker dome that have got more kind of like a white iridescence to them. They're really very pretty. I'm going to add some more double-sided tape onto the back of the shaker dome here. And I'm kind of adding this tape not just on the shaker dome, but where the shaker dome meets the cardstock. I'm then going to pop my sequins inside. And then I decided to remove the backing off of the tape. Now in hindsight, I wish that I'd removed the backing before I added the sequins in, because you'll see that as I remove this, I do accidentally kind of jiggle that cardstock, and then all of the sequins popped out and stuck to the tape. But these things happen, and thankfully there wasn't too many that I couldn't just pick them up and pop them back into that shaker dome. I'm then going to bring in some Barely art glue, and I'm going to add that onto the petals. I want to make sure that my backing is going to stick down really nicely, not just where the shaker dome portion is. Obviously I want to make sure that that sticks down really nicely so none of those sequins escape, but I also want to make sure that it's going to be stuck down really nicely onto the rest of those petals as well. So I can just pop that over, kind of flip it onto the back, and then I can adhere that down. So the front of that die cut is going to be on the other side at this point. I'm doing it upside down. So I've got time to wiggle that in place because I use that liquid glue. And then once I'm happy with the placement, I can press that down. And I'm just going to make sure that that shakes really nicely. It is always difficult to know how many kind of shaker bits to add into a shaker like this. I was pretty happy with how many I added. I don't want to fill it too much because then it's not going to shake that well. So it's quite nice also having that backing with the lighter colour, because when the sequins go towards the bottom, you can still see some kind of colour through it, which is nice. So I've now started assembling the other flowers. So I'm adding some liquid glue onto the bottom of these stamen pieces, and then I can pop the flower buds on top. And then I've got the flower centres here that I've cut from that beeswax again. And then I can add some liquid glue onto the back of those and pop those on those larger flowers. And I wasn't sure at this point which way round I actually wanted these flower centres. To be honest, I don't think it really matters, but I was a bit indecisive here. And then I've got the last flower centre that I can add onto the other style of flower here. So again, adding some liquid glue onto the base of that, and then I can pop that on top. You could definitely do this with some foam tape or something like that to add a bit of extra dimension, but I wanted to keep these fairly flat because I am going to adhere them down onto the card with some foam tape. So I can now start adhering all of my stems in place. Although I had a rough idea of the design of my card, it wasn't completely kind of set in stone. So I wasn't 100% certain which flowers I wanted with which stem, but I decided to add kind of like the longer stems onto the larger flowers because I thought that they would kind of go on the edge of the card and then kind of have the smaller stems with the smaller flowers. But this one here, I did kind of manipulate slightly and kind of push it further up, and for the most part like cardstock obviously does crack a little bit as you bend it, but most of it was covered up by those petals, so that worked quite well. I just wanted it to be a little bit taller. And then I've got all of these smaller flowers here that I can pop on the smaller stems. And I'm just trying to mix up which direction they're kind of going in with these smaller ones, so that some of them will be sort of facing to the right, some of them will be facing to the left, and the two different shades of pink. And then I've got one of the longer stems here to pop onto the shaker flower. So again, just adding that liquid glue at the top, and then I can pop that in place. So I'm going to set those aside for the glue to dry while I work on my sentiment. So I'm taking the Just Add Cake sentiment stamp set, and I'm using the sentiment that says birthday wishes. I just thought the size of this would fit quite nicely where I thought I wanted it to go. So I'm going to stamp it down onto some classic white colour wheel cardstock. So I've placed it down into my mini Misty. And then I can ink up the stamp using VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. So just inking up that stamp really well, and then I can stamp that down onto the cardstock. I'm a person who likes to double stamp, especially with sentiments, so I'm just going to ink that up again and stamp that down for a second time, just to make sure that I get a really nice dark crisp impression. This is a pigment ink, so I do want to give it a few minutes to dry. Once it's dry, I can take the coordinating die, pop that over the top and hold it down with some more Best Ever craft tape before running that through my die cutting machine. So now I've got my sentiment ready to go. I'm then taking my card base. This is made from the chiffon cardstock that I've scored and folded in half to create an A2 size card base. So that's a finished size of 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. I'm then taking most of the larger flowers here. I just want to make sure that I get the larger flowers in place first and then figure out where all of the smaller flowers are going to go afterwards. So once I'm fairly happy with how that's looking, I'm going to add some more Barely Art glue onto the back of the shaker flower here. For the other flowers, I am going to adhere them down with some foam tape, but this one is quite bulky because of that shaker dome, so I did just want to adhere that down flat. And for this card, I would mail it either in a padded envelope or a little box. Or I could hand deliver it, and that would probably be the best outcome. So I'm then taking the foam squares. These are the thinner profile ones. I really do like the thinner ones rather than the slightly thicker ones. It's just definitely down to personal preference. So I'm adding a few of the smaller ones here onto the back of the flower heads, and then I can add some liquid glue onto the stems. So just removing the backings off of that foam tape with my tweezers, and then just adding small dabs of glue onto the back of the stems. And I'm trying not to add the glue too high up on the leaves because I still want them to have a little bit of movement. I don't want them to be stuck down perfectly flat. Ordinarily with liquid glue, if I feel like I've got too much on it and it might ooze out, especially like with little stems and things, I do dab off the excess glue onto a scrap piece of paper. At this point in time, I couldn't quite find one, so I just used the back of my hand, and thankfully this glue cleans off really easily with just water. So just sticking that down there onto the right of the card. And then I was just trying to figure out if I wanted a small flower to go there. So I'm adding another foam square onto the back of the flower head, removing the backing off of that foam tape, and then again I can add liquid glue onto that stem there and leaves. And then I am going to have some of the flowers overhanging on either side. I am going to cut those off. I do honestly like to have things overhanging the side of cards, and I usually do keep them there rather than cut them off, but in this instance I did decide to cut them off. But the reason I tend to like having things hanging off the edge is that it makes it look a little bit like this is a fuller design, if that makes sense. Like the design will go outside of the card and not just kind of confined to the card itself, as if you're seeing just like a snippet of a bigger landscape. So I can continue by adding in these flowers, and then I am going to bring in the sentiment so that I can see where that's going to be placed. Want to make sure that I don't have any flowers underneath it, but I do just want to pop this one here so that a little bit of the Y just overhangs it slightly, again making it look, I'm not going to say realistic because obviously it's not realistic, but making it look a bit like it was kind of like a meadow of flowers. And then I can pop this one here behind the sentiment, but the flower head is going to be above where it is. And then it's just adding a bit more foliage towards the bottom, because a few of those stems don't actually have leaves on. It just makes it kind of a little bit fuller with some of the ones that do have more leaves. And then if I've got any fibres on the sides of the die cuts, I will remove those using my tweezers. I try my best to remove them before I stick anything down, but sometimes they just don't come off that way, and it's easier when they're stuck down onto the card. So I just like to use my tweezers there just to remove those fibres. And now I can finish off by adhering down that last flower. For the sentiment, I have die cut another layer of the die cut from white cardstock to add some dimension onto that. I do end up adding another layer onto that, but at this point I thought I would just add the one. I'm now cutting off the excess from the card. I like to flip over the card and do this from the back. I just find it a bit easier to use the edge of the card base to know where to cut that with my scissors, and I used the pro shears for that. I can now add that other layer onto the back of the sentiment. Initially I thought that I would adhere it down with some foam squares, but I found that I preferred it just being flat, but I did still want that dimension on it, so that's why I've used the layers of the cardstock instead. And I'm just going to place it down really lightly to start with. I can then bring in my T-square ruler to make sure that that's straight. Once I'm happy, I can press that down. And to finish off the card, I thought it'd be quite nice to embellish with some of the pink sequins in the kit. So I'm adding some small dabs of glue onto my card and then picking up those sequins using the pick up tool. And I like to pop them often kind of like either on top of things or kind of behind things. I feel like it makes it look like they're part of the design and not kind of like an afterthought, if that makes sense. So it's quite nice, especially with more of a busy look like this is. This is for me a busy look. I'm definitely a clean and simple card maker, so it is a little bit more on the busy side for me. So it's quite nice to kind of pop in those sequins behind some of the flowers. So I can just finish off with this last one here. And so that is the first card completed today. You can see how that shakes really nicely. You can also hear how lovely it shakes as well. I really like the sound of those sequins inside of that shaker dome. For my second card, I thought it'd be quite fun to use the same flowers, not the shaker one, but the smaller flowers, and have them inside of the mug from the birthday brew set. So I have die cut the sleeve and the cuff there from Seaside cardstock. This isn't in the kit. This card uses a few added extras not in the kit, but most of it is still in the kit. So I'm adding some liquid glue onto the back of the cuff piece here, and I can adhere that down onto the sleeve. There are a few different options for sleeves in this set, which is quite fun. And then I have cut the hand from Alabaster colour wheel cardstock. So I can add some liquid glue onto where the wrist is there, and then I can pop the sleeve on top. In this set there is also a watch, which is really fun to use as well, but I decided to keep it quite simple today and just have the sleeve and the hand. And then for the mug, I have cut the base layer from Teal Topaz cardstock. And then I've cut the top layer from Waterfall cardstock. And I used that piece there that would be the coffee or the tea inside, or hot chocolate, whatever you want. And I've cut that out so that I have the rim of the mug. So I'm going to place the light one on top of the dark one and have the flowers so it looks like they're inside of the mug. So I'm starting off by placing, or adhering I should say, these flowers down onto the mug, just adding some liquid glue on the bottoms of these stems here. So I realised at this point that I needed them to be obviously inside of the mug, but what I didn't realise was that I had to make sure that the top rim of the mug was showing so that it looked like they were inside of the mug and not just kind of placed half inside and half not. So at this moment I don't realise that. But I'm adding in these flowers, and at this point I kind of place it over the top just to check what I'm doing and realised, oh no, that it's not going to look right. So I managed to remove the last flower that I did on. The glue hadn't dried yet, which was great, but this one here, it did dry a little bit and I didn't want to rip that. I could have done because you wouldn't see that, but I realised that I could probably just pop that over the top of the flower and that was going to be fine. So I'm just checking to make sure that that is going to work at this point, and thankfully it is. So I can remove that and then add some liquid glue onto that top part of the rim, and then I can add it back over that flower and then pop it down onto the mug. I don't want to add any other glue at this point. I could have done the handle, but I don't want to adhere the rest of the top part of the mug because obviously I need those stems to fit inside of it. So if you're a new card maker, or even if you've been card making for a long time, I've been card making for about 20 years at this point. However, mistakes do happen, and thankfully most of the time you can kind of rectify them. So I'd hate to think that anyone that watches videos would think that everyone is perfect, because absolutely we're not perfect, and most of the time I will just edit out the mistakes in my videos. But I do know that it is nice to be able to show that mistakes happen as well. So like I say, if you're a new card maker in particular and you make the odd mistake, please don't feel like that's a bad thing. Mistakes actually only help because it makes you a better card maker in the long term. So I'm going to go along here and add in the rest of these flowers. I wanted some of these smaller flowers to kind of hang in front of the mug. So not obviously so it looks realistic, but if there were flowers in a mug, this is what they would probably do. And then I can just finish off with this last one here. And then once I'm happy with the placement, I can add some glue onto the inside of this mug and then also the handle there as well, and I can stick that down. I'm then taking an A2 size white card base, so that's a finished size of 4¼ inches by 5½ inches, and I'm placing the arm and the mug down just to see where I want them to be placed before I stick anything down. And I thought it'd be quite nice to have the bulk of the design in the bottom right hand corner. So I'm adding some Barely Art glue onto the back of the mug, and then I can adhere that down in place. And then although it's easier to add foam squares behind something before you adhere it down, I wasn't sure exactly whether I was going to adhere some down flat or adhere some down with the foam squares. So I ended up adding them after the fact, which is fine. I can just remove the backing off of those foam squares and then I can pop those behind the flowers using my tweezers. And I'm using the thinner profile ones here again. So just removing the backing off of that, and then I can pop that down, making sure that that's going to be really well stuck down. And then I thought it'd be quite nice for the flower that's overhanging the mug on the right hand side to have a bit of dimension as well. So I'm just going to cut down one of these foam squares, remove the backings off of that and pop that down underneath that flower. And then I'm just going to use the larger ones here for the arm. So adding some of those down onto the back of the arm. I'm not going to add them all the way to the tip of the hand because it is going to overlap where that mug is. So I'm just using some liquid glue for that part. I can remove the backings off of that foam tape and then adhere that down in place. I can then flip over the card and cut off the excess using the Pro Shears again. I absolutely love these scissors. They cut through foam squares and foam tape like butter. They just cut so perfectly. So again, just using the side of the card base as a guide of where I need to cut. I have then stamped another sentiment from the Just Add Cake sentiment stamp set and die cut that out. And I'm just adhering that down on top of the mug. Again, using my T-square ruler just to make sure that that's straight. And then to embellish this card, I thought I would bring in some pink Colour Essential gems. I really love the sequins on the first card, but I wanted something a bit smaller. And I absolutely love these gems because a lot of them are teeny tiny. And I tend to gravitate towards the tiniest ones. And then also the size that's just slightly bigger. I feel like I can scatter a few of them onto a card and that they not kind of distract from the main focal point. So I'm just adding a few of these around the mug and the flowers here, using my precision tool to do that. So just popping another one here on the right hand side, and then I'm going to bring in a last one. And I wasn't sure exactly where to place this down initially, so I moved it around a few times. In the end, I did decide on a placement here. And I like to, where possible, add embellishments in odd numbers. I just find it quite pleasing. And so that is the second card finished for today. I'm going to bring in my first card again so you can see that although I've used similar products and also a similar colour palette, you can see that the designs are completely different. And that's the great thing about this kit. You've got so much versatility in all of the different sets that you can mix and match together. Links to the products that I used will be listed over on the Spellbinders blog. Thank you so much for watching and I hope you have a wonderful day.